Growing up, I had a really angry acquaintance. I don't want to say friend because I really wasn't that close with him. I didn't spend a lot of time with him or know him very well. But this guy was weird for one particular reason. He had an unbridled rage against LGBT people. Now, I understand most young men are not the most sympathetic toward that movement, right? We use a whole lot of words from that community in, a derogatory way, as slurs and etc. So, that's pretty expected, right? I think most young men especially, are just kind of confused about it, and they just don't really know enough. Most of them grow up and they kind of get out of that. But this guy had an unquenchable hatred for that community, and it didn't make a lot of sense then. But as it turned out, years later, I found out this acquaintance I knew, he was gay. He himself was homosexual. He was a part of the community that he claimed to despise. Now, psychologists have called this behavior projection, where you take your own worst aspect or something about yourself that you don't like, and it's the one thing in the world that you just despise, you hate it, you complain about it. People that do this behavior, you have just complete rage for them, nothing but hatred. Carl Jung called this shadow projection, where you externalize parts of you, things that are inside of you, whether it's a behavior, it's an attitude, it's a way of being, a way of doing things, whatever it is, you externalize it. It's out there somewhere. And out there, it's the real problem. Now, what's an interesting thing to do is sit down and really think about, what do you complain about? What do you not like that other people do? I also knew another guy who I worked with, and he always complained that people were incompetent. People didn't do a good enough job, and, everyone was just kind of lazy. Well, I worked with him on a YouTube video one time, because I've been doing this for a long time, folks, and this guy didn't do a very good job. You could say that he half-assed it. And I just thought it was interesting that, the thing that he complained about a lot was something that he did himself. So this is a very common psychological behavior that people do. They just project things, something that they don't like or they don't accept about themselves. It's not a problem in here. It's not a problem in me. It's a problem out there. What gets interesting is when you look at someone like Joseph Stalin, who was constantly paranoid about being betrayed, being murdered by someone within his own ranks, someone that was a fellow communist, someone that had dedicated their entire lives, their entire careers to fighting for the revolution and liberating the working class. These were the people that he called comrades, but he was still worried about them stabbing him in the back. And well, when you look at Joseph Stalin, the man, the actions he did, you realize that it was all projection. Why was he so concerned about being betrayed? It was because he betrayed people. Why was he so worried about being manipulated? Well, because he manipulated people. It is exactly shadow projection. That is what Joseph Stalin did throughout, the later part of his career, and to the detriment of everyone that was in the Soviet leadership. So in this episode, we are going to be exploring the psychology behind Joseph Stalin. Hello there, friend, and welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. Before we get into the episode, I want to give a massive thank you to everybody over on Patreon for supporting the show, especially Matthew. If you guys want a shout out at the start of every episode or exclusive content, head on over to Patreon for more info. Next month's episode, that's exclusive for patrons, is going to be on the sexuality of Adolf Hitler. So there's some pretty wild stuff we talk about over there. So if that sounds like it floats your boat, check it out. But if it doesn't, don't, right? You don't have to, don't feel pressured. But either way, let's get into the psychology of Joseph Stalin. So I think first things first, we need to start by exploring how it is that we think of Joseph Stalin already, because that's going to, it's going to tell us a lot about how we already perceive him, some of our prejudices going into this episode. So we kind of see him as an iron-fisted dictator, at least Westerners do, right? I don't think there are a lot of people in the West that are like Joseph Stalin sympathizers. No one is saying that Stalin did nothing wrong, right? If you're saying that, man, you are on the fringe. You're out there. Because most of us view him as a pretty bad, pretty evil, iron-fisted monster. In a lot of ways, he was the embodiment of Soviet authoritarianism, where people were just, crazy communists, and we're the government, and we're going to tell you what to do, how to do it, why to do it. We're going to control every aspect of your life. And that was, very commonly associated with Soviet leadership, but especially in Stalin. And I would say that the entirety of Soviet authoritarianism traces its roots back to Joseph Stalin and, basically the precedent that he set. And folks, if we're going to be honest here, there's quite a bit of truth to these claims, to this narrative, right? To this way of viewing Stalin. Because, he did imprison quite a few people that didn't actually pose a threat, but he thought they did, so, well, they're going to end up in the gulag. Anyone that I don't like is going to be sent to the gulag, and that was pretty much the way he ran his government, which is, maybe it was practical, at least in his mind, but kind of immoral, right? Especially when you consider how bad the gulag actually was. I mean, go check out Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. Some crazy descriptions in there, man. Crazy stuff. Horrible what those people did to each other. To understand how ruthless Stalin was, he sent his own sister-in-law to Lubyanka, which is, the Moscow prison system, for saying too much about him in her memoir. So she was writing her own memoir, right? Everyone wants to do that. A little bit of a cash grab, and why not? So she was writing it, and Stalin said that, listen, you have to submit it to me to, proofread it, make sure you don't say too much about us or the regime or anything that I don't like, really. If you say something in your memoir that I don't like, that's bad, I'm going to edit that out. She sends her this memoir, or sends him this memoir, and he gets it, and he's like, you know what, you've said too much. I'm just going to send you to prison. In prison for sending Stalin a draft of her memoir. His own sister-in-law, no less, right? So this is someone that is in his family. If that doesn't tell you what kind of person Joseph Stalin was, geez, man, I think that tells you quite a bit right there. To understand why it is he behaved this way, why he was so paranoid and untrusting about these people, we need to start with his childhood. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of information that is available on Joseph Stalin's childhood, really because, well, he was the dictator of the Soviet Union. He was able to control what people knew about him and his personal life, and people were silenced and killed and censored and unpersoned and everything else. So, one of the reasons he did this, right, he kept his childhood and personal life secret, was that he studied the great czars. And he noted that the best of the best were very secretive about their personal life. Because, generally, people will look at the policies and how things are going in the economy, and if they want any wars, stuff like that. And he was hoping that people were just going to see his policies and just love him, right? And who cares about his personal life? We like what he does. Right? People tend to speculate about the personal lives because that's just what we do, right? It's what we're doing in this video right here. And, you tend to fill in the gaps with what you already think about this person. So if you liked Stalin, you liked his policies, you're probably going to think, yeah, he was a hardworking young kid, and he was a good person, and he was always nice to everyone. Just how you fill in the gaps. And Stalin noted that was what he was trying to take advantage of. Unfortunately for him, I don't think that's how most people view him these days. Now, part of this was also the fact that he was trying to hide the fact that he was a Georgian who ruled Russians. So around the 1800s, Russia basically annexed and invaded Georgia, and it became part of the Russian Empire. So by the time that he's growing up and living his adult life, he is someone that is an ethnic minority that is ruled by the Russians. And well, lo and behold, he eventually came to power in the Soviet Union. So here he was, someone that was a minority, who was now the iron-fisted dictator ruling a bunch of people of a different race, right? I mean, you have to imagine if the British Empire turned into a communist dictatorship and the guy running the whole thing was an Indian, right? Like, it would just be weird. It would be one of those things. He would probably try to draw attention away from the fact that he was an Indian, right? Someone of a different race, of a minority race, ruling a different, it's just weird. Creates conflict. So he was just trying not to hit on this fact. He wanted people to think of him as one of their own, as any dictator does, right? Now, another reason that he was kind of secretive about his childhood is that it was really common, even by this point, by the time he was in power, even before World War II, it was really common to explain away dictators as abused children, right? And to an extent, this does hold quite a bit of weight. If you look at any big dictator, someone that was really nasty, that did a lot of harm to the world, generally they were abused as children. They had a bad upbringing. They were, especially sometimes they were sensitive kids, and they just go out and they become monsters later on, right? And this doesn't just apply to Stalin, but it applies to a whole bunch. And Stalin didn't want people hitting on that fact. He didn't want people thinking of him as some kid that was just a victim of his circumstances and, just became a dictator because, well, my dad beat me, so I'm going to go and slaughter 1 million people, right? He didn't want people thinking that, so he kind of lied about it later on. So we need to start with what we do know about Joseph Stalin. We know that both of his parents were peasants. They were basically typical Georgians, right? And their first 2 children died. And that is always a really rough thing whenever, children die, because it's like the parents don't want to get too attached, right? Well, the first 2 died. What's going to stop this one from dying too? And they didn't, it wasn't like a miscarriage or anything. I think, his older brothers would have been older brothers. I think one of them died at 1 year old. I think the other died at 2, something like that. So it was just tragedy. And I could understand why his mom especially wouldn't want to get too attached, because it is very emotionally draining. Now, his father was a violent drunk. This guy would beat his wife, beat his kid, attack people, fight. I mean, this is just the kind of guy his dad was. His dad was actually known as Mad Besso, right? So around the town, it's like, oh, hey, Mad Besso's coming around. He's coming to whip our ass, right? Gonna beat us up. It's just how he was. And he was, part of the reason he was such a miserable person was that he was a failed independent cobbler. So, he basically worked on shoes. He made shoes, he repaired shoes, and he just wanted to do nothing but, work for himself, right? Typical. This isn't just the American dream. This is pretty much the dream for anyone, anywhere, at any time. Even Georgia during, the late 1800s. So he failed, though. Unfortunately, it was really difficult to sustain a living as anyone that was independent at all during this time. You got to think, right? If you're not making a whole bunch of money from your business, you're kind of out of business, right? And you just kind of had the way it worked, especially back then. And one of the interesting things to note is that his parents already had a rocky marriage before Joseph was even born. So by the time he comes around, it just exacerbates the problem. It gets even worse. You got to think, 2 people that are probably not meant for each other, 2 people that kind of have a rocky relationship, and then you throw a kid on top of that. It doesn't make it easier. It does not make it better. It makes it worse. And their already bad relationship was just blown out of proportion when they had their son. So one of the stories that we get, this is actually something that Stalin told his daughter years later. So we know this is probably true, although he could have been lying. But this is the way he portrays his childhood. So his dad was beating his mom, and he was trying to defend the mom, right? Because there's typical stuff, right? Don't beat my mom. So he throws a knife at his dad. He misses. And then his dad just goes ballistic. I mean, just insane rage. He loses his mind, right? He was probably drunker than hell. And he chases Joseph out of the house. I mean, literally, he has to hide at the neighbor's house to wait for his dad to calm down. Because if not, his dad would probably have killed him. So that was kind of a rough way to grow up, right? That leaves an impression on you. It does impact you in a lot of ways. And then there was his mom, who, she did her best. She wanted better for her son. And really what she did was she took solace in the church. That was the only safe place for her, right? Your husband is a violent alcoholic, a failed business person. He comes home drunk and beats his family because he's a failure, right? Where do you go for solace in that, right? You go to the church. And this is kind of why his mom wanted Stalin to become a priest. So there was a big push there, big religious push there. It was the only way forward, really, at least in her mind. There are quite a few historical rumors that she was allegedly a prostitute, that, maybe she had an affair. No one really knows. The prostitute theory is interesting, though, because it's allegedly because she's trying to provide for her son, right? Her husband's a failed business person, a failed cobbler, so he's not taking home any money. Any money he has is being spent on alcohol and vodka. So, maybe it could be. Maybe she did prostitute herself. And, if that is the case, right, that does not say a lot of positive stuff for Stalin growing up. I mean, could you imagine? I'm sure to an extent he knew. So, if that is true, who knows, right? Maybe she just had an affair. No one really knows. But generally, where there is smoke, there's a fire. So, who knows what she did, why she did it. Probably, not really good to be growing up and your mom's prostituting herself to different men, right? Not a good thing to be exposed to. Now, eventually, the family did find some peace because this alcoholic, abusive father needed to go and get a job, right? And there weren't any in their small town, so he had to go into Tbilisi. I cannot pronounce that. It's the capital of Georgia. Now, if you go and Google it, I'm sure you can find someone smarter than me to pronounce it for you. But he had to go there and get this low-paying factory job, right? Pretty common during those days. You're living in your small village, you're previously a farmer or an independent worker, whatever you do. Things aren't cutting it anymore, so you got to move to the big city, get a real job, and work hard in that factory. And that was what a lot of people did. That's what he had to do. And it was actually good for the family because he had to live there, right? It was just too far to commute at the time. Again, right, before cars, so he had to live there. So it was kind of good for the mom and kind of good for Stalin. And this is when his mom does something really good. She gets Stalin into religious school, despite them being poor, right? And this is, again, maybe some prostitution comes into play. Who knows what was going on? But these were not wealthy people. These guys, they were poor. I mean, I remember reading in Robert Service's book on Stalin, the biography, that they were typically malnourished, that even when they did eat, it wasn't really the stuff that's good for you, good for a good growing boy, right? So these people were poor. And she got her son into this religious school, which was kind of expensive. So maybe the prostitution came in, maybe the standard approach to it is that the school kind of took pity on them. They acknowledged that Stalin was a smart kid. So who knows? Maybe they just let him in. Again, we don't really know. His dad wanted to pull him out, and he eventually did. Pulled him out of school so he could follow in his footsteps. So, listen, I know I'm a miserable, drunk alcoholic, and I'm a horrible father, I'm a horrible husband, I'm terrible to my family, I'm working in a city that's far away, I barely visit you guys, and I hate my job, and I'm drinking, and just all around miserable person. And I want my son to follow in my footsteps, right? You just have to imagine what kind of person this is, right? I mean, this guy knew he was a miserable POS, and still he wants his son to follow in his footsteps. So he pulls him out of this very good school, this great opportunity, potentially life-changing opportunity, so he can go work in the factory with his old man, right? And this is Stalin now with his dad in the capital of Georgia, working in a low-paying, dangerous factory, right? There are no laws, really, and just suffering with his dad, right? Imagine now he's pulled away from his mom, right? This caregiver, this, probably the only positive force in his life. And then now he's pulled away from her, and now he's with his drunk, abusive dad, working in this miserable factory, probably upwards of 50 hours a week as a kid, right? Probably like 12, 13 years old. And I just can't imagine this was good. I just can't imagine he was happy or even content with life. He was probably very miserable. Now, it is interesting to note this is the only manual labor Joseph Stalin ever did. So for all the, liberate the working class stuff that he talks about, this is the only time he ever really worked, at least, with manual labor, right? Office stuff doesn't really cut it. Now, his mom did eventually get him back. There was this big dispute between the mom and the dad, and she eventually gets him back. He comes back to this small town, gets into this religious school, and things are, supposed to be set up for success. And this is when this dad, he just stops trying. He stops pretending to care about his son. Just, he's done. He's done. And early on, when Joseph Stalin was very young, he was exposed to a very common illness, and that was smallpox. And this smallpox did permanent damage to his face, and he was very insecure about it. Very insecure. You gotta think, right? This is right around puberty. This is when you're kind of figuring out who you are in society, your status, who you can become, right? I mean, this is a really important, pivotal moment in his life. And, well, what does he have? He's got smallpox. He's got a messed up face. In fact, he was so insecure about it that every image of him that ever was recorded, they airbrushed it, right? They photoshopped it. Didn't have Photoshop at the time, but, they edited out the smallpox that messed his face up. So for all the people that say, oh, Joseph Stalin was so attractive, no, he wasn't. If you saw what he actually looked like, all those photos were doctored. All of them. So that's how insecure he was. But, you could understand why his mom would kind of shelter him at this point, right? So he had this abusive father, right? There were all the previous children that had died, and now there's this. So you can understand why his mom was kind of protective, right? You could say that maybe he was a bit sheltered. And I couldn't blame his mom for acting that way. If, why would you want your son exposed to more of the world? You got this negative father figure out of the picture, and that's a good first step. And now it's kind of like, let's heal and recuperate and move forward. Well, Joseph was a little wild when it came to being exposed to the other boys, because they were kind of rough back then. So one of these childhood boys that knew Stalin wrote about him, quote, "Before he was enrolled at school, not a day passed without someone thumping him, and he would either go back home in tears or else he himself would rough someone up." So he had all of this rage, right? Especially when you're not the toughest kid around, when you're one of the kids that gets beat up. I know today we've kind of, clamped down on this. Stuff like this doesn't go on very much anymore, but, you got to think this is, over 100 years ago in rural Georgia. Little boys are going to beat each other up. And Stalin, he could hold his own. I would say he was probably about above average, but there were always going to be people tougher than him. He didn't like that. He didn't like getting picked on. So he started breaking the rules to win fights. So instead of, a good honest, fist to fist, you punch the other guy in the face, all right, knock him out. Stalin was like, screw it, man. I'm going for the groin kick. Kick him in the nuts and walk away, right? That's pretty much the way he started trying to win these fights. That being a sneaky cheater was preferable if it meant, he could win. And you gotta think, all of these different factors, the abusive dad and all the, the schooling, and then he's out of school and then he's back in school and moving and the factory work. And now these fights with these, boys and these gangs, this all left a very big impact on him. What are the lessons that he takes away from winning by cheating, right? You start winning all your fights because you kick the other guy in the nuts. What does that tell you? What does that reinforce in your brain? Well, it tells you that, maybe cheating is okay. Winning is the ultimate thing, right? We're all after winning. And as Stalin as a kid, this is the idea that was solidified in his mind. So later on, when he cheats and lies and steals and does all these other things to secure his own power, he's just doing what the world, was what the world told him to do as a kid. The behavior that was reinforced. Oh, hey, I kicked the other guy in the nuts and I win the fight. Boom. Maybe it's okay to cheat. Forget about the rules. And this is where we can get into an idea about both of his parents. They both encouraged a get to the top mindset, although in very different ways. So his mom was very much, let's get to the top the right way. Study hard and learn and think and apply yourself and be good at school and, right, become a priest. Move up in the world. Well, then there was his father. And his father was, he wasn't moving up in the, in the world, but what he could do is physically win fights, right? He could, especially because who was he fighting with? His wife and son, right? Unfortunately, I think he got a lot more of his father in him than you would even want. Because later on he was an alcoholic, he drank a lot, he was a miserable person, he was kind of a bully, right? So you could totally see how he became his father's son. And that is always the greatest tragedy of abuse, when the cycle repeats itself and continues. The victims become the perpetrators. Now, life became much more difficult for Stalin when he was hit by a horse and carriage. And what this did was it really messed up his arm and leg. So it was permanently damaged, right? Luckily in the short term, and a couple weeks he was back at school, he was good to go. But it left permanent damage. He couldn't really move it the way you would want. So, you just imagine what that means for those fights, right? He's not winning any fights anymore. He's got this messed up leg, messed up arm, but he wasn't having it. He was just going to double down on cheating. And as Robert Service notes in his Stalin biography, this didn't necessarily mean that he was going to become a dictator or a monster or a murderer or anything like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that he was going to go down that path. But in order to get to that tree, you needed all these seeds. So these are the seeds that eventually became the tree of Soviet authoritarianism and, thought crimes and just all the horrible stuff that Stalin did when he was in power. All of it. The seeds, they trace back to his childhood. Really, what do you do? This is your childhood, what do you do? So now we can start talking about his early ideology. So after his father basically, stopped trying, he developed a weird sense of sympathy for his father, right? Especially when you have a negative father and they're no longer part of your life. You can kind of, really clean up those memories. So his father may have beaten him and abused him and nearly killed him a couple times, but you know what? He's not part of my life anymore. I'm not getting beat up by old dad anymore. So, kind of view him a little differently. and he started seeing his dad as not a perpetrator, but as a victim of history. Because of course, right, he was influenced by Marxism. And Marxism, right, it's very easy to make the case, oh, we're all just victims, right? I'm a victim because, I got to work in this factory to support my family. So he just kind of excused all his father's horrible behavior because he was a victim of history. Right? He's being exploited by the capitalists. Of course, it doesn't really make sense. Like, even if you think about it for a minute, right? Even when he, tried being an independent cobbler, when he was trying to work for himself, even then he was still an abusive drunk. So even before he had to, shut down shop and go work in some miserable factory, even before then he was a horrible person. So it doesn't really make sense. But, right, people, you just don't think about it very much, right? And that's what Stalin did. He didn't think too hard on it. So yeah, he just sanitized all these memories about his father after he disappeared. And again, that's a pretty common thing, right? Reminisce on the good times. Even though, when that person was around, they beat me and abused me and were drunk all the time. So one of the big influences on him was reading The Patricide. And this was a famous novel by Alexander Kazbegi. And he was this really big Georgian writer. Probably doesn't live up to a Dostoevsky or a Tolstoy, on the scale of literary greatness, but he's definitely up there. He was famous during this time. In fact, The Patricide was very influential in not just the revolutionary movements, but especially in Georgia. It was kind of anti-Russian. So in this story, the main character, Koba, is this archetypal defender of the underdog. So you got to think, a Georgian Robin Hood, right? So there are all these rich, powerful people exploiting all the people at the bottom. So, we're going to get our righteous revenge on those darn rich people and those elites. We're going to beat them up and we're going to be ruthless. So in the story, Koba is just this crazy, bloodthirsty, violent little thug who has, nothing but contempt and animosity toward authority. So, pretty crazy stuff, right? And, when all is said and done, this was a very typical opinion at the time. You got to think, the Georgians were now subjugated to the Russians, something that was kind of a recent historical development, and that always sucks. And, you couple that kind of spirit with, anti-capitalism, and you can really see why, something like The Patricide could become so popular, right? Everyone's getting displaced by these big factories. These darn Russians are ruling over us. There's a real feeling of helplessness there. And when you have that feeling, you want revenge. And it doesn't matter if it's violent or not, right? They're exploiting us. They're making our lives miserable. So we are perfectly okay if we can just go and kill them and slaughter them and kill their kids and, do God knows what else. Perfectly acceptable. At least, if you're living through it, right? And after he reads The Patricide, Joseph starts demanding to be called Koba. So he identifies so strongly with that character that he makes it his nickname. And then this is the name he goes by until the revolution. So until about 1917, people called him Koba. Kind of a cool name too, let's be honest. And what's interesting is that Kazbegi himself was a big believer in this revenge, right? Revenge against the Russians, revenge against capitalism and business owners. So this kind of spirit was very much fostered, right? It was no longer just, a little seed planted. This was starting to sprout into a plant. And, another thing this little name did, right, Koba, it made Stalin seem like a tough guy. And what's interesting to note is that psychologists have noted that the tough guy nicknames are very common in paranoids, right? People that are very high in paranoia they adopt these tough guy names. So with that being said, Stalin is fitting the definition here, right? At least he's trending toward the norm. I'm going to be honest with you guys. We're going to skip over a whole lot of Stalin's life. We're going to just kind of cherry pick some of the psychologically interesting points and talk about those. But there's a lot we're leaving out. There's a whole bunch of stuff during his teenage years, and he was a prisoner, and then he escaped prison, and like there's just so much that we're not talking about. So just bear that in mind. This is just the psychological aspects alone. So he was very involved with the communist movement early on, and he kind of reinvents himself after the revolution. He changes his name to Joseph Stalin. Of course, Stal being a derivative of steel, right? So he kind of wants to be seen as, the steel man, right? You got to think, that kind of bolstered his own image, right? It also erased his Georgian heritage. He didn't want people thinking of him as some kind of minority, as some kind of outsider, someone that wasn't part of this movement. So Stalin, the name, did really good for him there. And he formed a relationship with Lenin to advance his own career, right? He kind of saw Lenin as one of the unelected leaders of this big movement, and he, wanted a relationship with him, pretty typical. It's very cynical the way he does it, though. And Lenin did not quite reciprocate the way Stalin wanted. You see, Lenin kind of saw Stalin for who he was. Didn't quite like him, knew he was kind of rough and gruff and kind of sneaky sometimes. If you remember your Russian history, you'll remember that there was a big what-if moment where Vladimir Lenin died. He died fairly young. Unforeseen circumstances. He got sick, and it was just a big tragedy because everyone really thought of him as the true revolutionary leader that the Russian people wanted, and he was going to lead this wonderful revolution. We're never going to know how that Soviet Union ends up. We only have the one that Stalin got. And as Lenin was dying, he wrote a covert political testament directly addressing some of his peers, right? Some of the other Soviet leaders. And he wrote about Stalin specifically, and he wrote some interesting stuff. Quote, "Stalin is too rude, and this defect, though quite tolerable in our midst and in dealings among us communists, becomes intolerable in a general secretary. That is why I suggest that the comrades think about a way to remove Stalin from that post and appoint in his place another man who in all respects differs from Comrade Stalin in his superiority, that is, more tolerant, more loyal, more courteous, and more considerate of the comrades, less capricious." So, there you have it. Lenin did not want Stalin to take power. Didn't want it. He knew things were going to go bad. Again, we don't know how much better things would have been otherwise. If the last century or so has taught us anything, it's taught us that communism doesn't really work, right? I don't think that's really up for debate. But maybe it wouldn't have been so terrible, right? Maybe if it had been Lenin or maybe just anyone that wasn't Stalin, it wouldn't have been so bad. But it was Stalin. So it was pretty bad. So after Lenin died, Stalin, he was really cynical, very Machiavellian about it. Because what he did was he aligned himself with Lenin's ideas, doctored photos of himself with Lenin. So you got to think, if someone photoshopping themselves with the former leader, yeah, man, we were best friends. We were home dogs. Stalin even created a propaganda movie where he hugged the dying Lenin. So he just doubled down on associating himself with Lenin and connecting himself with Lenin's popularity, because let's be honest, Lenin was a popular guy. Most people really liked him. And this was probably the smartest thing Stalin could have done, because what it did was now everyone associated him with Lenin and Lenin's legacy. And what eventually happened was opposing Stalin meant that you were being anti-Lenin. And you wouldn't dare be against Comrade Lenin, would you? So that kind of solidified his power in a lot of ways, right? Maybe it wasn't doing anything official through the offices or establishing whatever position, but, it's really a psychological thing. It's manipulation. The way people see and think about and perceive you. Very important. And again, you just have to imagine someone being a political leader and to associate themselves with someone that was popular that died, photoshopping themselves with it. Like, that is just the most cynical, crazy thing. And then even the propaganda movie, right? That's just wild. And then people see it and they think, oh, Stalin and Lenin were so close. And, well, Lenin actually didn't like Stalin, but the people didn't know that. The people didn't have this quote up here. People didn't have Lenin's political testament. So, kind of rough. And this is how Stalin came to control the Communist Party. But as he was to observe pretty early on, this was a hollow victory. Because despite rising to the ultimate seat of power, despite going far beyond he ever could have imagined or dreamed, right? You got to imagine a small peasant boy in some rural village in Georgia being beaten by his dad, rises to absolute authority of the Russian Empire, right? The former Russian Empire. This big country, big player in Europe. But it's a hollow victory. It is a hollow victory because it doesn't make him happy. Despite consolidating his power, he was more depressed than ever, more anxious than ever. He felt horrible all the time. And during this time, he was jealous of anyone who was better than him at anything. Yes, anything. So if someone could show Stalin up, maybe with the way they spoke, maybe with how smart they sounded, maybe with how much they knew about this or that aspect of the Soviet Union, they were basically sent to the Gulag. He was jealous of them, so, well, they had to go. They just had to go. So pretty early on, he was at least self-aware enough to know that something was wrong. He knew that he needed some kind of help, so he calls for a psychiatrist, right? So he needs help. He's like, all right, listen, man, I'm depressed and anxious and miserable all the time. Why? So he calls in a really big guy, Vladimir Bekhterev, who was a really big, famous guy at the time, very influential, and he assesses Joseph Stalin. And he's got some interesting conclusions. He called Stalin a paranoiac, which is more or less someone, typically, I think we all kind of know what this means, right? Someone that's paranoid all the time, someone that's constantly worried about this or that thing, right? And, well, that's not going to be too good for Bekhterev because Stalin orders his death. So, I don't know why he wanted a psychiatrist to begin with, right? You just have to imagine someone that's like, yeah, I'm kind of conflicted and messed up internally. I don't feel that good about myself and the way I'm behaving. I've got all these negative emotions all the time. I'm going to get a psychiatrist and then kill the psychiatrist when he tells me what's wrong with me, right? And it's just such a damn shame. Because if he had just listened to this guy, maybe did some kind of treatment or, thought about things, right? Figured his own stuff out, maybe he would have gotten better. Maybe he just wouldn't have become that horrible of a person. But instead of accepting that he has fault, he ordered this psychiatrist's death because obviously he's wrong, right? Obviously. So, Bekhterev may or may not have been poisoned by the KGB. We don't really know. He died, I think, a year or two later. So, kind of suspicious. And then, Bekhterev was more or less memory hold, right? Gone. They erased him out of the textbooks. They erased all of his work. Any contributions he ever made, gone. All gone. So, basically for the crime of accurately diagnosing Joseph Stalin, he was killed and completely forgotten. People weren't even allowed to say his name. He's just gone. And this behavior right here, this exemplifies one thing: pathological paranoia. It was one thing to be kind of paranoid about people before, but when you allow that paranoia, that distrust of people to control your life, and I mean, he killed a man and erased his existence, right? You got to think about that. That's a very serious thing to do. And he does it based off of his own paranoia. So that's just some pretty nasty behavior there. And by this point, it's bad. It's bad for Stalin. And this is where we really get the stereotype of the iron-fisted dictator. This is when it begins. Because this is the kind of stuff, he didn't just do this to Bekhterev, or there were a lot of people that were, randomly killed for, because Stalin just, oh, I don't like that guy's haircut. Oh, that guy sneezed when I was speaking, right? Kills him. Kills him for no reason. No reason. Memory holes him. Erases their entire existence. Kills their families. Right? I mean, this is the kind of stuff this guy did. And he even indoctrinated children, right? He didn't want anyone to think that he wasn't the greatest thing in the world. And he knew he wanted everyone to think he was so wonderful, so great. So he starts with the youth, right? That's what they always do. He criminalized criticism. So saying anything bad about him or the Soviet Union became a punishable offense. I mean, if you complained about the bread line, you could be sent to the gulag for that because, well, this is the Soviet paradise. What's wrong with you, right? Comrade Stalin made, set this bread line up for you. What, you got a problem with that? Right? So he even rewarded ratting on people for thought crime. So even you could be in your own house, be with your own family, and you complained about Joseph Stalin or the Soviet regime. There's a chance that, oh, hey, I can get some money if I turn you in. Get my dad sent to the gulag because he complained about Joseph Stalin's mustache, right? Who knows? Of course, Stalin could never live up to this stash, right? I know, you guys don't have to say anything, Unfortunately, those paranoiacs, they just can't grow it in. They just can't fill the stash. And, another interesting development is that he becomes an alcoholic. So he just, again, it goes back to his dad, right? Like father, like son. So he follows in the same footsteps. He's also abusive to his family in many of the same ways that his dad was abusive to him. Again, it's just the greatest tragedy to see the victim become the perpetrator. And this is where he just doubles down on the crazy. So he starts acting completely irrationally. Again, you got to think alcohol is now on top of his crazy paranoia. So you got a very pathological mental illness and you couple that with alcoholism. Not a good combination. So he starts murdering anyone who doesn't fit his idea for the greater Soviet Union, and that can be just about anyone. So a good chunk of the research for this video came from the psychopathography of Joseph Stalin. It comes from a great thinker from Columbia University. So they had an interesting quote on Stalin. So let's read it here. Quote, "While failure to perceive one's flaws is a common human trait, Stalin's case was extreme due to his intolerance of anything short of perfection in himself. This caused him to control the information that others received regarding him and his regime by means of intimidation and altering literature." So he identified so strongly with the Soviet Union that anything that was even a mild criticism, it just became a crime. There are no flaws here. I'm the perfect person. This is my perfect government. This is my perfect little paradise. And if you have a problem with it, I'm going to kill you. Of course, I'm not going to let you leave, right? You're not allowed to emigrate from the Soviet Union. So yeah, I'll just kill you, right? You got anything bad to say? You can't leave and you can't say anything bad. You just got to sit here and say I'm perfect and everything is perfect. So pretty wild stuff. Pretty wild stuff. And it got so bad. I mean, it was just so manipulative. And the worst part is Stalin was smart, right? He was smart enough to do these things and manipulate so many people. I mean, there were even pictures that were doctored, right? He would, have a disagreement, he would randomly kill someone he got jealous of, and they would just become unpersoned, right? Gone. Gone from public memory. You're not allowed to talk about them anymore. I just want you guys to look at this picture. I mean, this perfectly exemplifies what was going on here. Stalin, I mean, he just lost it. He fell out of favor with every single one of these guys at different times for different reasons. And one by one, they just all got photoshopped out. I mean, it's just wild. It's just wild, right? And you just get pictures like this. I mean, it's just so terrifying. I couldn't imagine having known Stalin and, the possibility of something like this happening to you. I mean, it's just horrible. Horrible, right? So as time went on, people kind of understood this is the way things are going to be. If Stalin has this or that opinion, well, we're just going to agree with him. Basically, don't say anything that Stalin doesn't like. Even if his opinion changes, right? Tomorrow he says collectivization is bad. All right, collectivization is bad. Forget about communism, right? Whatever thing he changes his mind on, just go along with it, because disagreement meant death. You disagree with Stalin, even on a minute thing, you were going to end up in the gulag or dead and memory holed and forgotten, erased from history. All for the crime of disagreeing with Stalin. In fact, one of his former allies, Nikolai Bukharin, thought that he was unhappy because he himself couldn't convince the world or himself that he was better than everyone. So a big thing with Stalin was that he had this godlike image, right? I mean, you gotta think back to the parades where people are carrying around these giant pictures of Stalin and these parades in his honor, and and the capital is, it's got a whole bunch of streets, Stalin Road and Stalin Street, right? Everything was supposed to be about the celebration of Stalin and how great he was and what a great thinker and a man of action he was. And just insane. But deep down, right? Deep down, Stalin knew he wasn't that great. He's just a person like anyone else. And he couldn't convince himself. He couldn't convince the world, right? Forget about anyone outside of the Soviet Union. I mean, at least inside of the country that you have control of, you can kind of dictate and control what people are allowed to say, right? You can control that to an extent, but you cannot control what the whole world thinks. So it was just this constant source of unhappiness because he just couldn't admit, maybe I don't know that much. Maybe I'm not that great. Maybe my country is kind of a crap hole that people don't want to live in, right? So, couldn't do it. And according to Bukharin, this was a big source of his unhappiness, on top of everything else, right? And again, deep down, he knows. He knows he's not a god. Right? No one can really convince themselves that they are the epitome of perfection. And even if they claim they do, they're lying, because deep down, we all know we're just people. We are flawed. We're stupid. We make bad decisions sometimes, and that's okay. It's okay. We're not supposed to live up to this crazy ideal because it's unattainable. Now, another thing that kind of played into his psychology and the way he thought of himself was he didn't quite believe it himself, right? And when you don't believe that you yourself are as great as, you tell everyone you are, you need this constant reinforcement. And that's what Stalin did. So he was constantly having, parades and celebrations and parties and everything else for himself because he needed his own grandeur, his own greatness talked about and thought about all the time. He always needed to be reinforced. Because, again, deep down, he knows. I mean, he even imprisoned religious leaders because he didn't want to compete with God. Right? You just have to imagine how insane that is. He didn't want people to pray to God because he wanted people to pray to him. What on earth? What on earth has to go on inside of your head to make you think that's a good idea? Yeah, a sane person would do this. Yeah. Insane. Right? It's just, and this is really, you can see his paranoia, his pathological paranoia taken to its extreme. Right? He doesn't even want God in his country, not because he disagrees with religion for whatever reason, but because he doesn't want to compete with God. He is God in his mind. No one else. No one else. This projection was deadly. It really was. It's all projection, because at the end of the day, what was Stalin doing here? He was suspicious of everyone around him. He was constantly questioning people's motives, constantly sending people to the gulag. For what? For the crime of, just being near him. Just being near him. Because Stalin, deep down, he knew. He knew that he was actually a cynical backstabber. He knew that he was a manipulative, sociopath that would do these terrible things and, distort the truth and then sleep at night. Right? You got to think, he did all these terrible things and he was okay with it. I mean, that blows me away. Blows me away. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, I feel bad if I cut someone off in traffic. Right? Imagine killing people for no reason, sending them to the gulag and unpersoning them and being okay with that. That blows me away, man. So if we're going to summarize things, we can say that Joseph Stalin was an extreme, pathological, paranoid person because he was projecting his own sins, his own cynicism, his own Machiavellianism, his own manipulation onto everyone around him. It wasn't that all these people were trying to backstab him and steal his power and make him look stupid. That wasn't going on. What was going on was that he did all those things. And so he thought that everyone else was doing those. He couldn't accept it when the psychiatrist said, listen, man, you're paranoid. He killed the psychiatrist. That tells you all you need to know. That tells you all you need to know. That is the psychology of Joseph Stalin. Make sure to follow the show if you're new here. Subscribe on YouTube, follow the podcast. Whichever way you like your history content. And make sure to check out the Patreon page if you guys want exclusive shoutouts at the start of the episode, or if you want to get exclusive content, right? And there's some pretty good stuff coming out there. So you'll get all the episodes that are already out, and there's quite a few. But then, next week or so, right, next month's episode is going to be Hitler's sexuality. Right, so we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of stuff. It's pretty weird. It is weirder than you would imagine. I just have to say that. Weirder than you can imagine. So it was just a wonderful topic. And, let's just say that it's going to be a fun episode. So if you guys are excited about that, you want to get that, head on over to Patreon for more information. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. This has been Michael from History for Thinkers, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.